So I'm Missy. I've been going to fellowship since I was probably 6. We moved here from Philadelphia. So I'd say I'm basically a lifer here. I started kind of noticing that I'm not normal physically in terms of like health issues. About between 10 and 12, I started fainting a lot. I started noticing like just things weren't right. And very quickly I was diagnosed with POTS, which is a autonomic disorder where your heart and your blood pressure can't get it together basically. And then a heart condition, which means my heart goes way too fast. So from an early age, I was familiar that sickness was just a part of my life, but I didn't know it would be my life. And that wasn't until I was about 18. Around 18 is when things started to really turn. And that's when we started to question, like, is this more than a heart condition? And through that, we had learned that I have a really rare form of Lyme disease. And with that, like, there really isn't, there's these long treatments, but I had never talked to anyone who was truly in remission or anyone who has truly overcome that. Yeah, so Lyme disease is a tick-borne illness, and I probably picked it up when I was about 6 years old, but it wasn't until I was about 18 that they discovered it. And that only happened through a bunch of other medical conditions, and they eventually tested for it. But what happens is people misunderstand because they think Lyme's curable. Like if you get Lyme within the 2 weeks and you're lucky enough to show a rash, because not everyone shows a rash, you can take antibiotics and you're good. The issue is when I got it when I was probably 6, 7, and didn't get it treated till I was like 18 through 20, it penetrates like every tissue. So what happens is like mine presented in a cardiovascular way. So I had 2 different heart conditions. It manifested in my central nervous condition, which is why I have POTS and some other autonomic issues. Your brain, it can cause a ton of mental health concerns. It feeds on like blood cells. Like it just attacks every tissue it can get into. The rest of my life looked bleak. I had huge dreams for myself. Like I loved traveling, so I had my whole classes, all of them were based around me traveling abroad to like New York and Florence, and I was gonna have this huge career, and I was gonna get married when I was 30, and I had a very specific life for myself. And up until that point, life had gone pretty much how I thought it would. And so for me, what that looked like after my diagnosis was I had to drop out of school, or at least go home. I was still doing some online classes. And then from there, I was taking 100 pills a day. I was laying in bed at all times. And then for probably 10 months, I just didn't leave bed. And they didn't like how my treatment progress was going. And that's the point where they put me on IV antibiotics. So I had a surgical procedure to put in a port, and I had my own at-home nurse, and I was infusing 6 hours a day, 5 days a week. And that was, during that time, like I'd use that, how I would describe that time was numb. I numbed everything. I just needed to not be aware of what I was truly going through. I couldn't even think of God. I couldn't even like open my Bible. It just made me angry. And I like numb and anger are how I would describe those periods in my life. It honestly just felt hopeless. And especially when you have these doctors telling you like, oh, it's, you don't really get rid of Lyme disease, or you have to do like, people have had Lyme for 20 years and they've never healed from this.
I wonder if you've ever had a really bad, no good, just plain awful day. Maybe you're similar to Missy in our video. You're gonna love how her story unfolds over the next 4 weeks. But maybe you can relate to her and you've had a really bad week or a really bad month, or maybe for you it was a really bad, no good, just plain awful span of years. See, I clearly remember the day that I was fired from my very first job. You might not know that about me, and I probably should qualify because growing up, it wasn't actually my very first job. Growing up, I was growing up in California, so I aspired to be a lifeguard, so that's what I did growing up, and I was a paper boy, and I was a referee for a short time. But after I graduated from college, you go out and you get a real job. And for me, some of you might know, I became a professional athlete. I became a professional soccer player. It was my dream my whole life. And that is the job that I was fired from. Professional athlete. You see, there was a time that I was playing for a team in South Africa. Happened to be the most popular team in the country of South Africa. And there was this particular day that we were playing against our biggest competition. It was the best team in South Africa at the time, a team called the Kaizer Chiefs. On that particular day, I didn't start the game. Now, you might not know I was a goalkeeper. And when a goalkeeper doesn't start the game, a goalkeeper usually doesn't play in the game. And so on that particular day, I'm sitting on the bench and I am in full relaxation mode, right? There's no chance I am going in this game. I might as well have the Cheetos. I'm there on the bench. My team is losing 3-0. It's not a great day, not a great game. And that is the moment I remember clearly. End of the first half, our coach, he was Swiss. He looks down the bench, says, "Treadway, get dressed. You're going in the game." You know, if you're me in full relaxation mode, I'm not happy. See, a goalkeeper can't even wear the jersey, the team jersey, if they don't start the game. They've got to remain completely neutral, so I'm scrambling, I'm putting on the jersey, I'm not happy because I don't think I'm going to play, and I really, honestly, don't want to play. I end up going in the game, and our team actually ends up winning the game 4-3. So we score 4 goals in the second half, and everybody is happy, and everybody is celebrating. And I walk into the parking lot, right? I take a shower, I do some media. I walk into the parking lot, and the coach of the team, the Swiss guy, is standing next to my car. Now, I don't know if you've ever had an experience where you are certain that you know exactly what someone is going to say to you, and then they say something totally different. Have you had that experience? Anyone? Anyone watching online? Have you had that experience? You know exactly what they're going to say, right? It's obvious what my coach is going to say in this scenario. And I was thinking, single people, right? Have you ever had that experience where you meet the man or the woman of your dreams and they are perfect and you just love them and they're amazing and you're absolutely certain you're supposed to get married until you hear it, right? Those dreaded words. Have you heard these? I hope not. I just want to be friends, right? Some of you can relate more than maybe you should, but I just want to be friends and parents. You know, maybe you've had that situation. You love your kids. You sacrifice everything for your kids, and you're certain you're always going to be a happy family, and you're certain everything's going to be fine until the day your kid says, "I hate you," right? And they probably don't. I'm sure they don't actually hate you. They don't mean it. But you never expect that's what your children are going to say. You never plan to get divorced, right? Like you get married and, you know, sometime 5.5 years into this, you're not planning on divorce. You don't anticipate the diagnosis. You're not thinking about the potential loss or the injury or the family strife that sometimes goes on. But it happens, right? And it happens more than we want to admit. See, I walk up to my car on that particular day in South Africa, and I am certain that my coach is going to tell me how great I played in the game. And that's when, instead, I walk up, and he says this to me, and I'll never forget these words, kind of just nonchalant. He says, "We can't afford to pay your salary. Clean out your locker. You're off the team." You see, for me, that was a really bad, no good, just plain awful day. It's 20 years later and I can still remember it like it was in that exact same moment. Because honestly, it didn't make sense to me. And I don't know if you've had that experience where something in your life, it just doesn't feel fair. Right? What right does he have? I was, whatever. It didn't feel good to me. And I didn't understand how that could happen on that particular day. But 20 years later, I want to show you something. I want to teach you something that I learned along the way. And this is the big idea for today. It's this. Your greatest obstacle is often your greatest opportunity. Make a note of that somewhere. Your greatest obstacle, it's often your greatest opportunity. And this is what we're going to see in the life of this woman named Hadassah. This is the woman we're going to be studying over the next 4 weeks. If you've got your Bible, pull it out. Now is the time. And find the book named after this woman, Hadassah. Right? We'll study her life over these coming weeks. In case you can't find the book of Hadassah in your Bible, Hadassah is also called Esther. One of only 2 books in the Bible that is named after a woman. Just a little fact. And her story begins in the year 483 before Christ. 483 years BC, Esther is a Jew, and she's living in Persia, which is modern-day Iran. See, God had sent the Jews into exile 100 years before this, 583 BC, because of their disobedience. At this point in history, most of the Jews have now returned home into their homeland in Israel because there was this Persian king. His name was Cyrus. He puts out a decree that the Jews were allowed to go home and rebuild their city. They were being led by these 2 guys. You might know them, Nehemiah and Ezra. Those names sound familiar to you? Their books appear right before Esther's in the Old Testament. See, at this point, the Jews are back rebuilding Jerusalem, and Esther is one of those Jews who has remained in Persia. She is an orphan. She was being raised by her older cousin Mordecai. And her story begins in chapter 1, and this is where we're going to start today, when there is this king named Xerxes. He's doing what kings do best. He threw himself a party. And this is what we're going to see. We're going to pick up Esther chapter 1, verse 2. It says this, "At that time, Xerxes ruled his empire from his royal throne at the fortress of Susa. In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles, for all the officials in the land. He invited all the military officers of Persia and Media, as well as all the princes and the nobles of all the provinces." And notice this, the celebration lasted for 180 days. Anyone ever been to a 6-month party? You see, this king liked to party, clearly. He throws himself a 6-month-long party. And some of you can probably relate. I'm not going to call you out in your college days, but let's just leave that at that, right? You can relate to this king named Xerxes. Here's the thing. I find this very interesting. After the 6-month party comes to a conclusion, that's when the real party begins. Look at verse 5. It says this, "When it was all over, the 6-month party, the king gave a banquet, another party for all the people. And these are the people from the greatest of the people to the least of the people." That's who this party was for, who were in the fortress of Susa. This party lasted for 7 days. It was held in the courtyard of the palace garden. The king likes to party. And you should notice the king also likes to drink a little bit. Look at verse 8. "By edict of the king, no limits," very important part of the story, "no limits were placed on the drinking. For the king instructed all the palace officials to serve each man as much as he wanted." You see what's happening in the beginning of this story? This is an all-inclusive, everyone invited, open bar type of a party. And on the 7th day of this feast, when King Xerxes was in very high spirits, which, if you look at the Hebrew, it literally translates like the sentiment means when King Xerxes was plastered. That's what it means. Like when King Xerxes was stone cold drunk, that's what in high spirits actually suggests. He told his eunuchs, verse 11, "Bring Queen Vashti, his wife, to him with the royal crown on her head. He wanted the nobles and all other men to gaze on her beauty. This is the scenario, 483 BC. The king has been partying for 6 months straight. He is totally drunk, and he has this great idea. I am going to show all of my friends, my guy friends, how beautiful my wife actually is. So he orders the queen Vashti, to be brought in so all his friends can see her. Now, Esther, you might be wondering, I thought this was a story about Esther, right? Esther is about to enter the story. One important nuance I want to point out in verse 11 before she enters the scene. Look at this. It says, Xerxes told his eunuchs to bring Queen Vashti in with the royal crown on her head. Critical to the story. Maybe you haven't picked up on this if you've read Esther before. With the royal crown on her head. Anyone know why this is critical? Absolutely to this story. You see, the king wants to impress his drunken friends. And so the king, who has all the power, he tells the queen she must come in and expose her beauty to all his friends, wearing the royal crown on her head. Which means he was telling her she could enter the room with only the royal crown, you get it, on her head. Apparently the queen doesn't like this idea, and so she refused. And good for her, right? Right? Good for her. But this one decision, it sets off a series of events that would literally change the course of human history. See, Vashti, she refuses to do the naked dance, and Xerxes gets mad. And all his male chauvinist buddies, they start to get worried. They start telling the king it's a bad example if the queen refuses to do what the king tells her to do. See, what if their wives, this is what these guys, the friends of the king, are thinking. What if our wives start to think that this is acceptable behavior, right? They are these male chauvinists, male-dominated society, 483 BC. And what if our wives start to think if they see the queen disobeying the orders of the king, then our wives are going to do whatever they want to do, right? This is a really bad day for these guys in the kingdom. So King Xerxes does the only thing an arrogant, prideful, male, chauvinistic king can think to do. What's he do? He kicks Vashti to the curb, right? Kicks her out of the palace, decides, here's what I'm going to do. I'll hold a little beauty pageant. We'll see who the most beautiful woman in the land is, and she will become the new queen. Here's how we meet Esther. Look at chapter 2, verse 5. Here's what it says. At that time, there was a Jewish man in the fortress of Susa whose name was Mordecai, son of Jair. He was from the tribe of Benjamin. He was a descendant of Kish and Shimei. His family has been among those who, with King Jehoiakim of Judah, had been exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon by King Nebuchadnezzar. This man had a very beautiful, a very lovely young cousin. Do you see her name? Hadassah. She was also called Esther. When her father and mother died, Mordecai adopted her into his family, and he raised her just as she was his own daughter. Now remember, just pause for a second. The king has issued a decree. The king is looking for the most beautiful woman in his whole empire, and he's hosting a beauty pageant. Look at verse 8. It says, as a result of the king's decree, Esther, Hadassah, along with many other young women, was brought to the king's harem at the fortress of Susa and placed in Haggai's care. Notice it says that Esther was brought to the palace, to the king's harem. See, I think this word harem should probably tell us something about the scenario going on here. But another translation of this same exact verse says this: Esther was taken. Very important to understand. See, it might seem like this grand privilege, and some of you ladies might be thinking, oh, it'd be so nice to be a queen. But what you need to understand about the story of Esther is that Esther didn't have a choice. Esther was taken. In the original language, the word taken, it means captured, it means seized, it means something or someone is being carried away by force. This is Esther. She is a Jew. She's living in Persia. It's not her own land, and she is minding her own business when on a particular day, with seemingly no say of her own, Esther's life takes this 180-degree turn. I want you to see the unfortunate reality early on in Esther's story, because we usually don't talk about it when we study the story of Esther. See, on this particular day in Persia, this beautiful young girl, Esther, she became a sex slave. And I don't know if you've ever noticed this before, because it's a horrible thought. We don't like to highlight this aspect of Esther's story, but this is what happened. On this particular day when Esther was taken, she immediately became the victim of this cruel and exploitative man, King Xerxes. See, this is a really bad, no good, just plain awful day for this young girl, Esther. And I started to wonder if you can relate. I wonder if you've ever had an experience or maybe a moment in your life where it just felt like everything in your life just took a 180-degree turn. Like everything in your life just changed unexpectedly. And maybe for you, it was the moment that you were sitting in the doctor's office and you heard the diagnosis. And maybe it was, for some of you, the loss of someone who you really loved very deeply. Maybe it was the loss of a job or hearing your spouse of 10 or 20 or 50 years say, I want a divorce. See, we all have moments in our life that seem outside of our control, where things in our life, they feel like they've been stripped, they've been removed, they've been taken from us. And it feels unfair in the moment, and it doesn't make sense in the moment. But listen to what Jesus says, John 16, verse 33. Jesus says this, in this world, right, this side of heaven, in this world, you will have trouble. I don't know if you know this is a promise from God. You might not like this promise. There will be things in your life that feel unfair. There's going to be some things in your life that don't make sense. This is what Jesus says. In this world, this side of heaven, this side of glory, this side of perfection, you're going to have some trouble. It's a promise, because we live in a sinful, broken world that is not as God created it and intended it to be. This is why Esther's story is so important. See, here's what we find. Your greatest obstacle, it's often your greatest opportunity. James 1, verse 2, it says, Dear brothers and sisters, when troubles of any kind, any type of trouble come your way, consider it an opportunity for great joy. 2 Corinthians 12, the Apostle Paul is writing to the church at Corinth and the church in general. And Paul is telling us of this struggle, really his life struggle, his life trial. And here's what he says. 3 different times I begged the Lord to take it away. Each time, he says to Paul, my grace is all that you need. My power works best in weakness. So now Paul says, I am glad to boast about my weakness so that the power of Christ can work through me. That is why I take pleasure, Paul says, in my weakness and in insults and hardship, persecution, and the troubles that I suffer for Christ. Paul says, when I am weak, then I am strong. See, here's what we find. through the story of Esther, it's this. Maybe. God always has a plan in your pain. As we look at the story, especially this first part of this story of Esther, and we kind of like to talk about the for such a time as this part of Esther. We're going to get there, right? That's in 3 weeks from now, but we are going to get to the kind of crescendo of Esther's story. There is a silver lining coming, but for today, we've got to sit in the pain, right? Because God always has a plan in your pain. Listen to how Pastor Tim Keller puts it. This man is fighting cancer in his own life right this very moment. Here's what Keller says. Some suffering is given in order to chastise and correct a person for wrong patterns of life. Some suffering is given not to correct past wrongs, but to prevent future ones. And some suffering has no purpose other than to lead a person to love God more ardently for himself alone and to discover the ultimate peace and freedom. See, I've found that you might not always notice God is working in your life and in the scenario and circumstances that you are in. But Scripture is clear. There's always a spiritual purpose for your earthly predicament. Always a spiritual purpose for your earthly predicament. If you think about the story of Joseph, this man sold into slavery by his brothers. And before he was ever sold into slavery, first he was tricked by his brothers, right? They tricked him, and then they stripped him, and then they threw him into a pit. And then he was sold into slavery. And you probably know this man's story. See, that was a really bad, no good, just plain awful day for Joseph. But remember, God always has a plan in your pain. So Joseph endures hardship, and Joseph, he ultimately suffers for years and years. And I guarantee, in the middle of his pain, if God came and said, here's another way, here's an out, here's an easier path, don't you think Joseph would have taken it? I guarantee he would have taken the option. But eventually, you might remember Joseph, he becomes the prime minister of Egypt. So Joseph has the position, and Joseph has the power, and one day Joseph has the opportunity for retribution with those brothers who sold him into slavery. They put him in this predicament. Remember, and look at this, right? Look what Joseph says to them in Genesis chapter 50. Here's what he says. You intended to harm me, brothers. You intended it to harm me, but God intended it for good. God brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people. See, God always has a plan in your pain. There's always a spiritual purpose in your earthly predicament. And so I have a question this morning, and it's a very simple question, but it's this. What do you do when there's an obstacle in your life? What are you supposed to do? See, if you want obstacles to become opportunities in your life, I want to just give you 3 quick things that you can do. Here's number 1. It's this. Remember, God is in control. Isaiah 14, verse 24, God says, it will happen as I have planned. This is God. It will happen as I have planned. It will be as I have decided. And Proverbs 19, verse 21, it says this, many are the plans in a man's heart, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails. See, no matter what the circumstance, God is still in control. Even when Joseph is sold into slavery, God is still in control. Even when Esther is taken captive by the king, God is still in control. No matter what is happening in your life, no matter what obstacle you might face, God is still in control. It's step number 1. You want to turn obstacles into opportunities. Remember, God is in control. Let me give you another. Step number 2. It's this: believe that God has a plan. There's a pastor in California. His name is Rick Warren. He wrote a pretty popular book. In it, he says this: God's plan isn't a map for your life that you will see all at once, but a scroll unrolled a little at a time. I wonder if you believe that. I wonder if you believe that God, He does have a plan, even when you don't understand the predicament. Jeremiah 29:11. I love this verse. I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to, this is what God's going to do in your life. Plans to prosper you, not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future. You see, whenever there is an obstacle in your life, remember God is in control. Remember God has a plan. Here's step number 3. It might be the most important. It's this: trust God with the details. See, I wonder if you know that Esther is the only book in the Bible that never mentions God. Do you know that? There's no other book in all of God's book that never mentions God. The only book is this book we are studying, never mentions God, like God is never referenced. Like God's name never, ever comes up. Yahweh, not Jehovah, no reference, no implication, no suggestion to the Lord God. Do you find that interesting? See, it makes you wonder, why would God put a book in His book where He doesn't seem to be present at all? And I really had to think about this. See, I've never included this. I've done a few series on Esther before, but I've never looked at it from this perspective. And I was thinking about this. But I wonder, probably there's moments in your life when you feel like God isn't there. Circumstances that you've had where you maybe felt like God's left the scene and you can't see God, and sometimes you can't feel God. And there are times in your life where you just can't seem to sense the presence of God. See, that's when you have to trust God with the details. And I think this is why Esther's story is included in God's book. You see, even though God is never mentioned in the book of Esther, this is what we're going to see over these coming 4 weeks, that God's fingerprints are all over the story of Esther's life. See, God is never mentioned, but you see God all throughout the narrative of who Esther is, and who Esther was, and who Esther becomes. You see, this little orphan girl, sold as a sex slave, she becomes the queen. We're going to read about this. She ultimately wins the favor of this prideful, arrogant, male, chauvinistic king, Xerxes. She wins his favor. She wins his approval. She goes on to save the entire nation of Israel from destruction. And it's not always easy, but you need to remember your greatest obstacles, they're often your greatest opportunity. See, 20 years later, I am convinced this is why I got fired from that very first job. Playing soccer in South Africa, which I loved. And to me, it didn't make sense. And to me, it didn't feel right. And it felt like everything at that moment in my life, it was just stripped and taken from me on that day. But what I realize now is that God had a bigger plan. See, all these years later, I can say with all certainty that I wouldn't be standing on this stage, preaching this message as a pastor living in Cleveland, Ohio. You see, if that didn't happen 20 years ago, I wouldn't have written this book about that experience, which got selected to be used as the evangelistic resource at the 2010 World Cup in South Africa. And so I would have never gone back to South Africa, which means I would have never met my wife, which means I would have never had my son, which means I would have missed so much of God's best in my life. You see, God has a plan in your pain. There is always a spiritual component, a spiritual purpose for your earthly predicament. And what I've learned over all these years, and what I continue to learn, is that your greatest opportunity is often found in your greatest obstacle. So this morning, I just want to pray for you. I don't know where you're at this morning. I don't know what circumstance or situation you're facing, but I know that God's in control. We see that in the life of Esther, and we're going to see how God weaves himself throughout the testimony and story of her life. So can we pray together? Why don't you bow your heads, close your eyes, you're watching online. Why don't you join us as we pray together? Father, I thank you for your word. And I thank you that not every story that we find in the Bible is up and to the right, where it's all victory and triumph and celebration. But so often we find trial. So often we find destruction. So often we find difficulty. And I think that's because it mirrors the experience that so many of us have in our life. And so Jesus, this morning, I pray for your people right where they're at, sitting in their seats and watching at home. And I pray that the power and the presence of your Spirit might remind them that you are in control, that you have a plan in their pain, that you have a purpose in their predicament, and that you will ultimately make a way for their good, which leads to your glory. Oh, Father, we want that more and more in an increasing way in and through our lives. We want your glory to be made known to the world. And so, Father, lead us and guide us, protect us, and move us forward for your name's sake. And all God's people said, amen. I hope you're excited about this series and this study of the life of Esther. I know that as I've been looking at her story in the weeks to come, we're going to see some victory. But before you get there, you got to go through the pain. So God bless you this week. I'm praying that God be with you. I'm praying that God be for you, that he goes before you, that he walks behind you, and that he goes with you every step of the way. Have a great week, and I'll see you next week.
What a great message. I love these moments where as a family, the family of God, we really focus on his word. And I believe the appeal today is to not just hear the word, but to do the word. So I would simply prayerfully ask you to consider not all the things that you heard, but to make decisions. Do what they say as make an action item on how you can take the word and apply it on Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday, because we believe at this church that God's word works in your life when you come under it. So again, if you want any more information on Fellowship Bible Church, you can go to fellowshipcleveland.com. If you feel like you would like to become a regular giver, you can do it off our website as well. You do fellowshipcleveland.com/give. Again, if you have any prayer requests or you want to learn any more about the church, you can always drop us a line at info@fellowshipcleveland.com. Hey, from all of us here at the church, I pray that you have the best day ever. We'll see you soon.